demonstrate the procedure for changing the throttle cable on a Polaris 400 two-stroke engine. The ATV we have here is a Polaris 400 Sport. It's the same procedure on all the 400s. The Sportsman, the Scrambler, same engine. So we'll show you how to get in and change the cable on the oil injection pump and also to the carburetor. On this ATV I removed the rear plastics because I'm doing some additional service work on it. But to change the throttle you only need to remove the plastics that cover the gas tank and the headlight. The first step is to remove the two screws on each side that hold the cover over the gas tank. To make things simple, I've already loosened the screws so we can just take them out. Here you have a quarter-inch screw that has a 3/8" flange head, and down here you have another quarter-inch screw with a Phillips head. Just take them out and set them aside. After the screws have been removed, you can remove the side panels. Next, you need to remove the cover over the radiator cap so you can reach in and unhook the tabs that hold the plastic to the front. On each side you have to reach in with your finger and press, or use a screwdriver and push to get these tabs to snap out of the groove, as you can see. The next step is to remove the gas cap and then carefully remove the plastic cover over the gas tank. I always put the gas cap back on to keep contaminants out. On the back of the headlight plastic, you'll find a small screw on each side, which is used to hold the plastic to the control panel. I've already removed the screw, but it fits right there and uses a T25 Torx head. Near the front of the headlight plastic, you'll find a screw on each side. This is a 1/4 inch with a 3/8" flange head. You'll just need to remove it. Remove the cap on the oil tank. Lift off the plastic and disengage the cable to the headlight. And I always put the cap back on to keep out dirt and contaminants. Now we can start removing the throttle cable. The first step is to remove the cable from the carburetor. The lid to the carburetor is easy to unscrew and remove, but there's a spring, a jet needle, a clip, and a washer and a cap that you all have to pay attention to as you remove it, because the cable has to be removed from the slide as well. Unscrew the carburetor cap using an 8mm wrench. Now for the unfun part, you need to remove the throttle cable from the oil pump. On a Polaris 400, the oil pump sits on the front of the engine, right tucked in right below the exhaust, behind that plate that's covered with 3 bolts. To get at it, you can either jack up the front to remove the left tire, or you can simply turn the wheels and crawl in from the side to access it. The oil pump cover is held in place with 3 bolts. You'll need an 8mm socket or 8mm wrench to remove these. Now I've already pre-loosened these, so they're just finger tight. Now you can see the gasket. You may want to remove it to get it out of your way. And now you have access to the oil pump. Normally the cable is wrapped around the bottom of the pump, but in this case we're replacing the cable because it's frayed and then broke. Rotate the pump lever counterclockwise in order to remove the cable. Once you have the cable from the oil pump disconnected, you'll need an 8mm and a 10mm wrench to unscrew the cable from the oil pump cover. Once the nuts are loose, you should be able to use your fingers to unscrew it. If you're having trouble and you're replacing the cable, you can always just cut the top of the cable with a pair of cutting pliers. And easily extract it. The final step for removing the cable is to use a pair of pliers to loosen the jam nut. And then, if necessary, a 1/2-inch wrench, but if not, then just unscrew it with your fingers. Okay. Done with that portion. Installing your throttle cable is essentially the reverse of the uninstallation process. Feed the throttle cable up and around the gas tank over to the throttle. So you wrap your throttle cable around the front of the handlebars, pull the cable out so you can insert the barrel connector into the throttle, and there, and then pull that back to give yourself, and then press down and hook it in place. Now thread the cable into the throttle. For future adjustment, I'd move this jam nut forward about 1/8 of an inch to 3/16 of an inch. Give yourself some adjustment and play later. Just as a side note, the cover should have some type of a gasket material if it's this style of throttle. If the gasket is missing, you'll need to replace that. If water gets down inside here, this will corrode and ruin this whole mechanism. Replace the cover, insert the screws, and tighten with a screwdriver. Now is the part that seems to be the most challenging, getting the slide attached back to the carburetor throttle. You'll have 3 parts. You have the spring, you have the jet needle, which has its clip, and also this little plastic washer, which may still be stuck inside the slide. If this plastic washer is missing, you'll need to find it or replace it. It's critical that this jet needle be at the correct height in the carburetor. The first step is to squeeze the spring and hold it out of the way while you assemble the slide mechanism. You'll notice this will vary on some carburetors, but you notice this part here, when you insert it into the slide, you want to make sure that that is where the throttle cable slips into the slide. Next, Insert the jet needle with the washer. And lastly, slip the cover in to lock the throttle cable in, keep it from coming loose. And there you have it. It's ready to insert into the carburetor. The slide goes back into the carburetor with the cutaway portion facing towards the airbox. Also, you need to make sure this jet needle goes down into the needle jet. So line it up. Turn it slightly, and then it should just lower right in without any resistance. Line up the cap. Make sure it's threading on correctly, which can be somewhat tricky. And tighten. Let me take just a moment to talk about the barrel end that comes on some of these throttle cables. When you get the throttle cable for a Polaris, you'll have an end that looks something like this. This is designed to go in the slot on the slide of the Mikuni. However, if you have an older style ATV or Mikuni carburetor, you may have this style where it's missing that. This will not fit in a slide made for this cable. So your option really is to take a file and just file this round part off and the other part around here to where it looks more like this so that it'll fit correctly. Now that you have the carburetor assembled, it's time to adjust the throttle. If you'll notice, initially there's a lot of play in the throttle. So we need to adjust the throttle cable by turning the screw on the top out to take up some of the slack. So turn the screw on the top of the carburetor counterclockwise to help take up some of the slack in the cable. As you're doing this, you want to test the throttle to ensure that it has just a little bit of slack before the throttle starts lifting the slide. When the throttle feels about right, you turn the jam nut down and tighten it with an 8mm metric wrench. If you've turned the screw on the carburetor out a fair amount of distance and it still has a fair amount of slack in the throttle, you can adjust it further by using the screw on the throttle itself. Turn it counterclockwise to move it out, and then reach down and test it. Make sure it has just a little bit of play in there. And then when you get that right, go ahead and tighten up the jam nut. As you can see here, we have the throttle cable that we need to attach to the pulley. The best way I've found is to use a small ratchet and rotate the pulley 180 degrees. Then you have to hook the end of the cable over the little tab and then make sure the cable feeds around the pulley correctly. Now this is easier said than done, so you may have to spend a few moments working with it to get it attached. And if it doesn't fit around the pulley, you'll need to wind the pulley back and work the cable around so that it's secure. Okay, once you have it hooked, just allow it to wind back around, and now you'll need to work the throttle to confirm that the cable is wrapped correctly around the pulley and that it's not hanging or binding. Here's a close-up picture of the oil pump. What you want to do is adjust the cable so that there's a little bit of oil flow as the engine is at idle. You can check this by looking at two things. One is the location of this peg, which is what the pulley rests against when the cable is completely loose. Also, you want to look at this mark on the pulley. If you look at how it's oriented, it's a little bit to the left of the peg when the engine is at idle. It's about 1/8 of an inch gap, roughly. If you have that gap there with that mark to the left of the peg, then you probably have about the right amount of oil flow when the engine is at idle. If you want to further check it, you can look at this mark here. If you give the engine just a little bit of gas and it starts to accelerate, this mark will line up with another mark that's not visible but is right below the pulley and is visible through the window. If you're just starting to accelerate the engine and that mark lines up with this hidden mark, then you have the oil flow adjusted appropriately.